The Unseen Tenant. It was 2012 when I moved into my first apartment on the outskirts of a small town in upstate New York. The building was old, built in the 1920s, and had a strange history that I only discovered much later. It was the kind of place where the floors creaked, the walls seemed to whisper, and the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and memories. My unit was on the top floor, a small one-bedroom apartment that felt cozy yet oddly isolating. The first few nights were uneventful, and I quickly settled into a routine. However, something began to change about a week in. It started with small things, keys going missing, lights flickering, and the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and the adjustment of living alone for the first time. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m., drenched in sweat. The room was unbearably hot, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I reached for the lamp on my bedside table, but it wouldn't turn on. Frustrated, I fumbled my way to the bathroom in the dark, splashed water on my face, and went back to bed, eventually falling into a restless sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The photograph of my family that I kept on the nightstand was lying face down. I knew I hadn't touched it. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that I must have knocked it over during the night, but the unease lingered. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances grew more frequent and more disturbing. At night, I would hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I would hear soft knocks on the walls, but when I pressed my ear against them, there was only silence. The flickering lights became more intense, often plunging me into darkness at the most inconvenient moments. One evening, I decided to talk to the building manager, an elderly man named Mr. O'Malley, who had lived there for decades. I mentioned the strange occurrences, expecting him to laugh it off, but instead, his face grew serious. He leaned in close and lowered his voice. "Do you know the history of this place?" he asked. I shook my head, feeling a chill run down my spine. "This building has seen a lot over the years," he continued. "Back in the 1950s, there was a man who lived in your apartment. He was a recluse, never spoke to anyone, but he had a reputation for being strange. One night, his neighbors heard screaming coming from his unit. When they went to check on him, the door was locked, and the screams stopped. They broke the door down and found him hanging from the ceiling dead. But the strange thing was, the windows were sealed shut, and the door had been locked from the inside. No one ever figured out how or why it happened." Mr. O'Malley paused, his eyes clouded with memories. "They say his spirit never left. Tenants have come and gone, but everyone who's lived there has experienced something." I left the office with a sense of dread, but I tried to brush it off. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But that night, as I lay in bed, the air in the room grew thick and cold, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but something felt wrong. I opened my eyes, and there, at the foot of my bed, was a shadowy figure. It was tall, its features obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there watching me. The room felt like it was closing in, the darkness pressing against me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. I was paralyzed with fear. After what felt like hours, the figure slowly turned and walked towards the door. As it passed through the doorway, the lights in the room flickered back on, and I was alone again. I sat up in bed, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I knew then that I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The next day, I packed my things and moved out. I never went back. Years later, I heard that the building was condemned and torn down, replaced by a new complex. But every now and then, I think back to that apartment, and I wonder, was it just a ghost, or was there something far more sinister lurking in the shadows? The Phantom Caller. In 2007, I was working the night shift as a 911 dispatcher in a small rural town. It was usually a quiet job, especially after midnight. The town had a low crime rate, and most of the calls I received were either medical emergencies or false alarms. But there was one night that still haunts me to this day. A night when I received a call that changed everything. It was just after 2 a.m. and the radio was quiet. I was sipping on a cup of coffee, trying to stay awake, when the phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, which wasn't unusual, so I answered with my standard greeting. 911, what's your emergency? There was silence on the other end. I could hear faint breathing, like someone was there, but not speaking. This wasn't uncommon. Sometimes people would call and be too scared to talk. I tried again. Hello, can you hear me? Is there an emergency? More breathing, but no response. I started to feel uneasy. There was something about the silence, the steady, rhythmic breathing, that felt off. I had dealt with prank calls before, but this felt different. I decided to stay on the line just in case. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that I almost missed it. I strained to listen, leaning closer to the phone. Help me, the voice said. It was a woman's voice, barely audible, and filled with fear. Ma'am, where are you? What's your location? I asked, my heart racing. There was no answer, just more breathing. Then, after a few seconds, she whispered again, he's coming. My blood ran cold. Who's coming? Ma'am, you need to tell me where you are so I can send help. But the line went dead. I immediately tried to trace the call, but it came from an unregistered number, and there was no way to pinpoint its location. I alerted the local police, giving them the details and the approximate time the call came in. They assured me they would look into it, but without a specific address or more information, there wasn't much they could do. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. I kept replaying the call in my head, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. A few weeks later, I was working another night shift when the phone rang again. It was the same number. My heart skipped a beat as I answered. 911, what's your emergency? This time, there was no breathing, no whispering. The line was completely silent. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I waited, hoping to hear something, anything, but the call ended abruptly. I reported it to my supervisor, who suggested it was probably just a technical glitch. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The fear I felt during that first call was real, and I couldn't ignore it. Over the next few months, the calls continued sporadically. Always the same, an unknown number, silence, sometimes a faint whisper, but nothing more. The police investigated, but they never found anything. No missing persons reports matched the timeline, and no crimes were reported in the area during those nights. One night, about 6 months after the first call, I was at home, enjoying a rare night off. I had just settled into bed when my cell phone rang. The number was unknown. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitantly answered, my hand trembling. Hello. There was silence, just like before. Then, after a long pause, I heard the same voice, soft, trembling, and filled with terror. He's here. The call ended before I could say anything. I immediately called the police, but there was nothing they could do. I didn't sleep at all that night, and for the next few weeks, I was on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting something or someone to appear. The calls stopped after that night, and I never heard the voice again, but the experience left me shaken. I left the job a few months later, unable to shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, watching, waiting. To this day, I wonder who she was and what happened to her. The calls were never explained, and the mystery remains unsolved. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my house, I think I hear the faint sound of breathing, and I remember the fear in her voice. And I can't help but wonder, what if he's still out there, the watcher in the woods? In the fall of 2010, I took a job as a park ranger in a remote national park in the Pacific Northwest. The park was vast, covering hundreds of miles of dense forest, rugged mountains, and deep valleys. It was beautiful, but it could also be incredibly isolating. My job was to patrol the park, assist hikers and campers, and ensure that everyone was safe. One of my duties was to make sure the trails and campsites were clear, especially before the harsh winter months set in. There was one particular trail, known as Devil's Hollow, that had a reputation among the rangers. It was rarely used, winding deep into the woods where the trees grew so thick that they blocked out most of the sunlight. The locals avoided it, and there were countless stories of people getting lost and never being found. As the newest ranger, I was assigned to check the trail before it was officially closed for the season. The hike was long, and I planned to camp overnight near an old ranger station that had been abandoned years ago. I packed my gear and set out early in the morning, the crisp air filled with the scent of pine and earth. The trail was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. As I made my way deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the natural unease of being alone in the wilderness, but the feeling persisted. By late afternoon, I reached the old ranger station. It was little more than a small weathered cabin, long abandoned and partially overgrown by the forest. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Despite its condition, it was the only shelter for miles, so I set up camp nearby and started a fire to keep warm. As dusk fell, the forest around me grew darker and more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in, and the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. I tried to focus on the crackling fire, but every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. Eventually, I decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. The night was unnaturally quiet. No owls, no insects, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a noise. It was faint at first, a distant thumping sound, but it quickly grew louder. It sounded like something, or someone, was banging on the door of the old ranger station. I sat up, my heart racing, and listened intently. The banging continued, slow and deliberate, echoing through the silent woods. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dim, flickering light around the campsite. I pointed my flashlight towards the ranger station. The door was swinging back and forth, creaking on its rusty hinges. But what caught my attention was the figure standing just inside the doorway. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden in the shadows. I could only make out the outline of its body, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there staring at me. I called out, asking if they needed help, but there was no response. The figure remained still, its presence menacing. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, and I slowly backed away towards my tent, keeping the flashlight trained on the figure. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a force that made me jump. I stumbled backward, nearly falling, and when I looked back at the ranger station, the figure was gone. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. I knew I couldn't stay there, so I quickly packed up my gear, doused the fire, and started back down the trail. The darkness was suffocating, and every step I took felt like I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, but the woods were empty. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead, just as dawn was breaking, that I finally felt safe. I reported the incident to my supervisor, who dismissed it as just my imagination, possibly a trick of the light or exhaustion. But I knew what I saw, and I wasn't the only one. Other rangers had mentioned strange sightings and eerie encounters in Devil's Hollow, though none had seen anything as clearly as I had. I refused to go back to that trail, and luckily, I didn't have to. The winter came early that year, and the trail was officially closed. I left the park ranger job the following spring, but the memory of that night stayed with me. The vanishing hitchhiker. In the winter of 1998, I was a college student returning home for winter break. My family lived in a small town in the Midwest, and the drive was long, about 5 hours on a mostly deserted highway that cut through miles of farmland and dense woods. It was a route I had taken many times before, and I knew every curve and turn by heart. It was late in the evening when I left campus, hoping to avoid traffic and make it home before midnight. The weather was bitterly cold, with a light snow falling and the wind howling through the trees. The road was almost empty, just me and the occasional semi-truck passing by. About 2 hours into the drive, the snow started to come down harder, reducing visibility. I turned on my high beams and slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The landscape around me was a blur of white, the only light coming from my headlights reflecting off the snow. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw something up ahead, someone standing on the side of the highway, their figure barely visible through the swirling snow. It was a woman, wearing a long coat, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to stay warm. I was startled to see anyone out here in this weather, so far from any town or rest stop. I pulled over and rolled down my window. The woman approached, her face pale and drawn, her dark hair matted with snow. She looked cold and scared. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Do you need a ride?" She nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. I unlocked the passenger door, and she climbed in, shivering uncontrollably. I turned up the heat, trying to make her comfortable. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't think anyone would stop. "No problem," I replied. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road," she said, her voice trembling. "There's a small town about 15 miles from here." I knew the town she was talking about, a tiny place called Willow Creek. It wasn't much more than a few houses, a gas station, and a diner. I had passed through it before, but I couldn't imagine why anyone would be walking to or from there in this weather. As we drove, I tried to make small talk, asking her where she was coming from and what had happened. But her answers were vague, almost evasive. She said she had been visiting a friend, but she wouldn't say where. Every time I glanced over at her, she seemed more and more distant, staring straight ahead as if lost in thought. After a few minutes, I noticed something strange. Despite the blasting heat in the car, she wasn't warming up. Her skin remained pale, her lips almost blue, and her clothes still appeared damp with snow that hadn't melted. We drove in silence for a while, the road ahead barely visible through the heavy snowfall. The atmosphere in the car grew increasingly tense, the air thick with unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Finally, we reached the turnoff for Willow Creek. I slowed down, about to ask her where exactly she needed to be dropped off, but when I turned to speak to her, the seat next to me was empty. The woman was gone. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the icy road. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, trying to figure out what had just happened. There was no way she could have gotten out without me noticing. The door hadn't opened, and the car hadn't stopped. I got out, frantically searching the road and the surrounding area, but there was no trace of her. The only footprints in the snow were mine, leading from the car to the side of the highway and back. In a panic, I drove into Willow Creek and pulled into the gas station, the only place still open at that hour. I ran inside, the bell above the door jangling loudly as I entered. The attendant, an older man with a grizzled beard, looked up from behind the counter. "You okay, son?" he asked, eyeing me warily. I told him what had happened, describing the woman in detail. As I spoke, his expression grew somber, and he shook his head slowly. "You're not the first," he said. "People have been seeing her for years. She's the ghost of a young woman who died on this highway back in the 1950s. Car broke down in a snowstorm, and she froze to death before anyone could find her. Ever since then, folks driving this road have picked her up, but she always vanishes before they reach the town." I felt a chill run down my spine, the warmth of the gas station doing nothing to ease the cold that had settled deep inside me. "Best thing you can do is get back on the road and keep driving," the attendant continued. "There's nothing you can do for her now." I left the gas station in a daze, my mind racing. As I got back into my car, I couldn't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see her sitting there again. But it was empty, and the cold air inside the car felt even more oppressive. The house on Maple Street. In the summer of 2003, I was working as a real estate agent in a small town in New England. Most of the properties I dealt with were quaint, colonial-style homes or modest suburban houses, but there was one listing that stood out, a large old Victorian house on Maple Street. The house had been on the market for years, and no one seemed interested in buying it. The few people who did express interest would back out suddenly, usually after touring the house. I was intrigued by the property. It was a beautiful house with a lot of potential, even though it was a bit rundown. The price was low, which made it even more of a mystery why it hadn't sold. My boss asked me to take on the listing, hoping I could finally close the deal. When I first visited the house, I was struck by its grandeur. It had a towering structure with steep gables, intricate woodwork, and large, ornate windows. But there was also something unsettling about it. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the paint was peeling off the walls. The house seemed to loom over the street, casting long shadows even in the midday sun. I scheduled an open house for the following weekend, determined to find a buyer. On the day of the event, I arrived early to make sure everything was in order. As I walked through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air inside was thick and musty, and the floorboards creaked with every step I took. The house had a strange layout. The rooms were large but oddly shaped, with narrow hallways that seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. There were several small, dark rooms that felt more like closets than living spaces. The basement was the worst, damp, cold, and filled with a foul odor that I couldn't identify. Despite the house's condition, several potential buyers showed up for the open house. They were all impressed by the size and style of the home, and I was hopeful that I might finally sell it. But as they walked through the rooms, I noticed a change in their demeanor. They started to seem uneasy, glancing around as if they were expecting something to happen. One couple, in particular, caught my attention. They were young, in their late 20s, and seemed genuinely interested in the house at first. But as they toured the second floor, the wife suddenly stopped in front of one of the small rooms. Her face went pale, and she grabbed her husband's arm. "I don't like this room," she whispered. "Something's not right." Her husband tried to reassure her, but she insisted on leaving immediately. They hurried out of the house without even finishing the tour. The other potential buyers left shortly after, all with similar excuses. Something felt off. They didn't like the atmosphere. The house gave them a bad feeling. By the end of the day, I was frustrated and confused. I decided to do some research on the house, hoping to find out if there was a reason why everyone seemed so uncomfortable there. That night, I went to the local library and started digging through old records and newspapers. What I found sent chills down my spine. In the late 1800s, the house had been owned by a wealthy family named the Bennets. They were well respected in the community, but there were rumors about the youngest son, Edward. He was said to be troubled, often disappearing for days at a time and acting strangely when he returned. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house at night, screams, banging, and what sounded like someone crying. In 1892, Edward was found dead in one of the small rooms on the second floor. The official cause of death was suicide, but the details were never made public. After his death, the family quickly sold the house and moved away. The house changed hands several times over the next century, but no one stayed for long. There were numerous reports of strange occurrences, doors opening and closing on their own cold spots, and the sound of footsteps when no one was there. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The house had a dark history, and it seemed that whatever had haunted Edward Bennet was still there. The next day, I went back to the house to close it up. As I walked through the empty rooms, I felt a growing sense of dread. The house was silent, but the air was heavy with an oppressive energy. When I reached the second floor, I hesitated before approaching the small room where Edward had died. The door was slightly ajar, and as I reached out to push it open, I felt a sudden chill. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. I stood frozen, listening. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound, like someone knocking on the floorboards from below. It grew louder, more insistent, until it was echoing through the entire house. I backed away, my heart pounding. The haunting of room 217. In the fall of 2015, I took a job as a night auditor at a historic hotel in the heart of New Orleans. The hotel was one of those old, grand buildings with high ceilings, ornate chandeliers, and long, dimly lit hallways. It had been built in the early 1900s and was rumored to be haunted, but I didn't pay much attention to the stories at first. I just needed the job, and working the night shift meant I could focus on my studies during the day. The hotel was a maze of hallways and staircases, and on quiet nights, it could feel like a labyrinth. Guests would occasionally mention odd experiences, a cold draft, flickering lights, or the feeling of being watched, but it was all easily explained by the building's age and creaky infrastructure. However, there was one room that had a reputation among the staff, room 217. The housekeeping staff would refuse to clean it alone, and even the most seasoned workers avoided going in there after dark. The stories varied, but they all agreed on one thing: something was wrong with that room. One night, while I was working the graveyard shift, the hotel was unusually quiet. The lobby was empty, and the only sound was the ticking of the old clock behind the front desk. Around 2 a.m., the phone rang. It startled me, as most guests were asleep by that time. "Front desk, how can I assist you?" I answered. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by the sound of static. Then, a voice, faint and distant, spoke. "Room 217. Please help me." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The voice was barely audible, almost as if it was coming from far away or through a bad connection. I tried to ask what was wrong, but the line went dead. I checked the computer system to see who was staying in room 217 that night, but to my surprise, the room was marked as vacant. No one had checked in, and the room wasn't booked for the next few days. Curious and a bit unnerved, I decided to investigate. I grabbed the master key and made my way up to the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the old carpet muffling my footsteps as I approached room 217. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as I stood outside the door. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. I reached for the light switch, but it didn't work. The room remained shrouded in shadows, and the silence was deafening. I could feel the temperature drop as I ventured further inside. The room was empty, no furniture, no bed, just bare walls and a cold, hardwood floor. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. In the far corner of the room, there was a figure, a woman, her back turned to me, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned nightgown. Her hair was long and matted, and her shoulders were hunched as if she was sobbing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew the room was supposed to be empty, yet there she was. I called out to her, asking if she was okay, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head to the side, just enough for me to see her profile. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark and hollow. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, her expression a mix of sorrow and something darker, something that sent a wave of terror through me. I took a step back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, my imagination running wild. But the fear in my gut told me otherwise. The woman didn't move, didn't blink, just continued to stare at me with those empty eyes. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into complete darkness. I fumbled for the doorknob, my hands shaking, and when I finally managed to open the door, I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't stop running until I reached the lobby, my heart racing and my mind reeling. I tried to tell myself that it was just a hallucination, a product of stress and lack of sleep, but deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. The next morning, I reported the incident to my manager, who listened quietly before nodding. "You're not the first," he said. "That room has a history. Years ago, a woman staying in room 217 took her own life. Since then, there have been reports of strange occurrences, guests hearing her cries, seeing her shadow. We try to keep the room unoccupied, but sometimes she calls out." I asked why the room wasn't sealed off, why they didn't warn people, but the manager just shook his head. "It's an old hotel," he said. "People expect ghosts. It's part of the charm, they say. But we do what we can to keep her at peace." The faceless man. It was the summer of 2009, and I had just graduated from college. To celebrate, a group of friends and I decided to take a road trip through the Pacific Northwest, camping and hiking along the way. We were excited to get away from everything, to lose ourselves in the wilderness, and to disconnect from the outside world for a while. Our final destination was a remote campsite deep within the Olympic National Forest. We'd heard stories about how secluded and beautiful it was, nestled among ancient trees and far from the nearest town. After days of traveling, we arrived at the trailhead that would lead us to the campsite. The sun was beginning to set as we shouldered our packs and started down the path. The forest was dense, the trees towering above us and blocking out most of the remaining daylight. The air was cool, and the only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. The trail was narrow, winding through the trees with little to no sign of human presence. It felt like we were the only people for miles, which was exactly what we had wanted. We reached the campsite just as darkness fell. It was a small clearing surrounded by thick woods, with a fire pit in the center. We quickly set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and started a fire to keep the night chill at bay. As we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories, the conversation inevitably turned to ghost stories. One of my friends, Mark, mentioned a local legend he had heard about a man who roamed the forests of the Pacific Northwest. He was said to be a spirit, a lost soul who had died in the woods and was now cursed to wander them forever. People called him the Faceless Man. According to the legend, the Faceless Man would appear to hikers and campers, but only at night. He had no face, just smooth, featureless skin where his eyes, nose, and mouth should be. He never spoke, never made a sound, but he would watch, always watching. We laughed it off as just another creepy campfire tale, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me as Mark finished his story. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own, and the darkness beyond the trees felt suddenly oppressive. We eventually retired to our tents, each of us slipping into our sleeping bags with the sounds of the forest all around us. I was tired from the day's hike, but I couldn't fall asleep. The silence was unnerving, and I found myself listening intently to every rustle, every snap of a twig, wondering if it was just the wind or something more. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was startled awake by the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the footsteps stopped just outside. For what felt like hours, I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening to the silence. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound like someone dragging their hand across the fabric of my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as the scraping continued, moving slowly from one side of the tent to the other. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. Suddenly, the scraping stopped, and the footsteps resumed, moving away from my tent and disappearing into the woods. I lay there, my mind racing, trying to convince myself that it was just one of my friends playing a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I emerged from my tent, exhausted and shaken. The others were already awake, and I could tell from their expressions that they hadn't slept well either. We exchanged nervous glances, but no one mentioned what had happened during the night. As we packed up our gear, I noticed something strange. There were no tracks around my tent, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. The ground was undisturbed, the leaves and dirt untouched. It didn't make sense, but I didn't say anything. I just wanted to get out of there. We left the campsite and hiked back to the trailhead in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The forest, which had seemed so inviting the day before, now felt menacing, the trees closing in around us as we made our way out. The mirror in the attic. In 2014, I inherited a house from my great-aunt, a woman I barely knew. The house was old, built in the late 1800s, and located in a small, rural town in Pennsylvania. It had been in the family for generations, but after my great-aunt passed away, there were no other relatives to claim it, so it became mine. When I first arrived at the house, I was struck by its age and size. It was a large Victorian-style home with tall windows, a steep roof, and an overgrown garden that looked like it hadn't been tended in years. The paint was peeling, and the whole place had an air of neglect. But despite its condition, there was something charming about it, and I decided to move in and fix it up. The inside of the house was a time capsule. Most of the furniture and decor hadn't been changed in decades, and there were boxes upon boxes of old belongings stored in every room. The attic was particularly cluttered, filled with dusty antiques, old trunks, and forgotten heirlooms. As I began the daunting task of cleaning out the attic, I came across an old, ornate mirror, propped up against the wall and covered in a thick layer of dust. The mirror was large, with a heavy wooden frame carved with intricate patterns. Despite the dust and dirt, I could tell it was a beautiful piece, and I decided to keep it. I cleaned the mirror carefully and hung it on the wall in my bedroom. It fit perfectly with the room's antique aesthetic, and I admired the way it reflected the light and made the space feel brighter. But almost immediately after hanging it, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small, easily dismissible things. I would wake up in the morning to find the mirror slightly askew, even though I was sure I had hung it straight. Items on my dresser, which was positioned directly in front of the mirror, would be moved or knocked over, even when I knew I hadn't touched them. Then the dreams started. Every night, I dreamed of the mirror. In the dreams, I would be standing in front of it, but my reflection wouldn't match my movements. I would raise my hand, and a reflection would remain still, or it would smile when I wasn't smiling. The dreams grew more vivid and disturbing each night, and I started to dread going to sleep. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I had just had the most terrifying dream yet. In the dream, I was lying in bed, staring at the mirror. But instead of my reflection, I saw a woman, pale with hollow eyes and long dark hair, standing in the mirror's place. She was staring directly at me, her expression filled with malice. As I watched in horror, she reached out from the mirror, her hand stretching toward me, and I jolted awake just as her fingers brushed against my skin. I sat up in bed, trying to calm my racing heart. The room was dark, but the mirror seemed to glow faintly, reflecting the dim light from the street lamp outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, and every time I looked at the mirror, I expected to see the woman from my dream. Unable to sleep, I got out of bed and left the room, heading downstairs to the living room. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, too frightened to go back to sleep. The next morning, I decided to get rid of the mirror. I couldn't stand to have it in the house any longer. I went back upstairs, determined to take it down and store it in the attic. But when I entered the bedroom, I stopped in my tracks. The mirror was gone. I searched the entire room, then the whole house, but the mirror had simply disappeared. There was no sign of it, and I couldn't understand how it could have vanished without a trace. I even checked the attic, thinking I might have somehow moved it in my sleep, but it wasn't there. I was both relieved and unnerved. I didn't know what had happened to the mirror, but I was glad it was gone. The nightmare stopped, and the uneasy feeling in the house gradually faded. But the mystery of the mirror lingered in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder if it would ever reappear. A few weeks later, I decided to sell the house. It was too big and too old for me to maintain, and I wanted to move on from the unsettling experiences I had there. The new owners were a young couple, excited to restore the house to its former glory. Before I left, I did one last walkthrough of the house to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. As I climbed the stairs to the attic, I noticed something strange. The door to the attic, which I always kept closed, was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my heart pounding with a sense of dread. And there, in the corner of the attic, was the mirror, exactly where I had found it the first time. The shadow in the window. In the winter of 2007, I moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Chicago. The building was old, built in the 1920s, but it had been renovated recently and had a lot of charm. The rent was affordable, and the location was convenient for my job, so I was thrilled to move in. The apartment was on the ground floor, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light during the day. The living room window faced the street, offering a view of the neighborhood. I loved the cozy feel of the place, and I quickly settled into my new routine. But it didn't take long for strange things to start happening. The first night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something odd. The window in the living room, which I had closed and locked earlier, was slightly open. I was sure I had locked it, but I brushed it off, thinking I must have forgotten. Over the next few days, I noticed the same thing happening again and again. No matter how many times I checked and locked the window, I would come home to find it open. Sometimes just a crack, sometimes fully raised. It was unsettling, but I figured it was an issue with the old building. Maybe the window didn't latch properly or the lock was faulty. One night, I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I heard a soft tapping sound. I sat up, listening closely. The tapping was rhythmic, faint but persistent, like someone gently knocking on glass. My heart started to race as I realized it was coming from the living room window. I got out of bed and slowly made my way to the living room, the tapping growing louder with each step. When I reached the doorway, I froze. There, silhouetted against the window, was a dark figure. It was standing just outside, its face obscured by the shadows. The tapping continued, and I could see the outline of a hand pressed against the glass. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move, didn't try to speak or make any noise other than the steady tapping. After what felt like an eternity, I finally gathered the courage to move. I turned on the nearest lamp, and as soon as the light flooded the room, the figure vanished. I rushed to the window, heart pounding, but there was no sign of anyone outside. The street was empty, and the window was slightly ajar, just like all the other times. I quickly locked it again and pulled the curtains shut, trying to calm myself down. The next day, I told my landlord about the strange occurrences. He listened, nodding thoughtfully, but didn't seem particularly concerned. He mentioned that the building was old and that sometimes the windows could be tricky, especially in the winter when the wood expanded and contracted. He promised to have someone check the lock, but I could tell he didn't take my story seriously. That night, I made sure to lock all the windows and double-check everything before going to bed. But around midnight, I was jolted awake by the same tapping sound. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My heart raced as I realized it was coming from the bedroom window. I turned on the bedside lamp and slowly turned to face the window. There, just beyond the glass, was the same dark figure. It was closer this time, its outline sharper and more defined. I could see its hand pressed flat against the window, and though I couldn't make out any facial features, I felt its eyes on me. I was frozen with terror, unable to move or even scream. The tapping continued, growing louder and more frantic, as if the figure was trying to get my attention, to be let inside. I wanted to run to get out of the apartment, but my body wouldn't respond. Suddenly, the figure's hand moved. It wasn't tapping anymore, it was scratching at the glass, dragging its fingers across the window in a slow, deliberate motion. The sound was grating, like nails on a chalkboard, and it sent a wave of panic through me. Finally, I managed to break free from my paralysis. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what was happening. The dispatcher tried to calm me down, asking if I had a weapon or if there was a way to lock myself in a safe room until the police arrived. I told her about the figure, about the scratching at the window, and she assured me that officers were on their way. But just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. I looked back at the window, and the figure was gone. The curtains were drawn, and the room was silent again, but I could still feel its presence, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. When the police arrived, they searched the property but found no signs of anyone being there. There were no footprints in the snow outside, no fingerprints on the glass. They chalked it up to a prank, maybe someone trying to scare me, but I knew it was something more than that. The voice in the woods. In the summer of 2011, I took a trip with a few friends to a remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. We were all looking forward to a week of hiking, fishing, and just getting away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The cabin was isolated, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was the perfect spot to disconnect. The first few days were everything we'd hoped for, peaceful and relaxing. We spent our days exploring the woods, cooking meals over a campfire, and enjoying the clear night skies filled with stars. But on the third night, something happened that none of us could explain, something that still haunts me to this day. We had spent the evening sitting around the fire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night and headed inside the cabin. The others went to bed, but I wasn't quite ready to sleep, so I decided to step outside one last time to take in the night air. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just an overwhelming stillness. I stood on the porch, staring out into the darkness when I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, so soft that I thought I had imagined it. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice, distant and echoing, calling out a single word. Help. I froze, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. Help me, the voice called again, more desperate this time. Every instinct told me to turn back, to go inside and lock the door. But something about the voice drew me in. It sounded so real, so full of fear and pleading. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward the trees. As I entered the woods, the voice grew louder, guiding me deeper into the darkness. Help me, please, it repeated, and I followed, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dense underbrush. I must have walked for what felt like hours, the voice leading me further and further away from the cabin. The trees grew thicker, and the path became harder to navigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, needing my help. Finally, I reached a small clearing, and the voice stopped. The silence was sudden and complete, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I stood there, turning in circles, shining my flashlight around, but there was no one there. No sign of anyone needing help. Just me, alone in the dark. A wave of dread washed over me as I realized how far I had wandered. I didn't recognize the area, and the path back to the cabin was nowhere to be seen. Panic started to set in, and I quickly turned around, trying to retrace my steps. But the woods seemed different now, disorienting, almost alive, with shadows that moved in the corners of my vision. As I hurried back through the trees, I heard the voice again, but this time it was different. It was closer, almost right behind me, and the tone had changed. It was no longer pleading, it was mocking. "Help me," the voice whispered, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and branches, desperate to find my way back. The voice followed me, growing louder and more distorted, as if it was all around me. "Help me," it taunted. "Help me, help me." I didn't stop running until I burst out of the woods and into the clearing where the cabin stood. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving with fear and exhaustion. My friends were already asleep, oblivious to what had just happened. I didn't tell them about the voice. I didn't want to seem crazy or scare them, but I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the voice in my head, repeating those words over and over. The next morning, I convinced my friends that we should cut the trip short and head back home. I made up some excuse about work or an emergency, but the truth was, I couldn't stay in that cabin another night. Something was out there in those woods, something that had lured me away with that voice, and I didn't want to find out what it was. The abandoned playground. In the summer of 2006, I worked as a camp counselor at a summer camp in a rural part of Virginia. The camp was situated near a small, forgotten town that most people had never heard of. The town had been largely abandoned years ago, with only a few residents remaining. The campgrounds were expansive, surrounded by dense woods, with a large lake at the center. One afternoon, during a free period, a group of campers and I decided to go exploring. We'd heard rumors about an old, abandoned playground deep in the woods, a place where the local kids used to play before the town was deserted. The idea of finding it intrigued us, so we set out with flashlights and snacks, eager for an adventure. It didn't take long to find a narrow, overgrown path leading away from the campgrounds. We followed it, weaving through the trees, our excitement growing with each step. The woods were thick and silent, the canopy of leaves blocking out much of the sunlight, casting everything in a greenish shadow. After about an hour of hiking, we finally stumbled upon it, the abandoned playground. It was a strange sight, hidden deep in the woods and completely overgrown. Rusted swings hung limply from their chains, creaking softly in the breeze. A seesaw lay crooked, one end buried in the dirt, and a slide stood covered in moss and vines. The whole place had an eerie, forgotten feel, as if it had been left untouched for decades. The kids immediately started exploring, laughing and joking as they climbed the rusting equipment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The playground felt off, as if the air itself was heavier, pressing down on us. There was no birdsong, no insects buzzing, just an unnatural stillness. As I watched the kids play, I noticed something strange. At the far end of the playground, partially hidden by a thicket of bushes, was a merry-go-round. It was old and faded, with chipped paint and twisted metal bars. But what caught my attention was that it was spinning, slowly and steadily, as if someone had just pushed it. I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was completely still, and there was no wind that could have set it in motion. I walked over to the merry-go-round, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more I felt a sense of dread building inside me. I stopped just short of the merry-go-round, watching as it continued to spin. It was then that I noticed something else, a set of small footprints in the dirt, leading away from the merry-go-round and disappearing into the woods. The prints were fresh, as if someone had been there recently. But we were the only ones who had come this way, and the kids had been on the other side of the playground. A sudden, overwhelming urge to leave gripped me. I called out to the kids, telling them it was time to head back. They groaned and protested, but I insisted, my voice firmer than usual. There was something wrong with this place, something I couldn't explain, but I knew we needed to get out of there. As we made our way back through the woods, the atmosphere felt different, heavier, darker. The kids had gone quiet, sensing my unease. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following us. But the path remained empty, just the trees and the shadows watching us leave. We finally reached the campgrounds, and the moment we stepped out of the woods, the feeling of dread lifted. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and everything felt normal again. The kids quickly forgot about the playground, distracted by other activities, but I couldn't get it out of my mind. That night, after the campers were asleep, I spoke to one of the older counselors about what I had seen. She listened carefully, her expression serious. "You're not the first to see it," she said quietly. "That playground, it's been there for as long as anyone can remember. People say it's cursed, that something happened there years ago, but no one knows for sure. The locals avoid it, and we usually tell the kids not to go near it." I asked her what she thought caused the merry-go-round to spin, but she just shook her head. "Some say it's the spirits of the children who used to play there, still trapped in that place. Others think it's something darker, something that shouldn't be disturbed. Whatever it is, it's best to stay away." I didn't sleep much that night, haunted by the image of the spinning merry-go-round and the footprints in the dirt. The next day, I made sure the kids stayed close to the camp, and I never mentioned the playground to them again. The house in the cornfield. In the summer of 2008, I was traveling through the Midwest, visiting some friends and taking a road trip across the country. One evening, after a long day of driving, I found myself on a rural highway in Nebraska. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the endless fields of corn that stretched out on either side of the road. I had been driving for hours and was getting tired, so I started looking for a place to spend the night. As I drove through a small, nearly deserted town, I noticed a sign for a bed and breakfast a few miles off the main road. Figuring it would be a charming, quiet place to rest, I decided to check it out. The road leading to the bed and breakfast was a narrow gravel path that wound through miles of cornfields. As the sky darkened, the stalks of corn swayed gently in the breeze, creating an eerie, whispering sound. The only light came from my car's headlights, cutting through the growing darkness. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the house. It was an old, two-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, set back from the road and surrounded by corn. The house looked weathered and worn, but there was a light on in one of the downstairs windows, so I parked the car and made my way to the front door. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I was greeted by a musty smell, like the house had been closed up for years. The interior was dimly lit, with old-fashioned furniture and decor that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. A woman in her late 60s or early 70s emerged from the back of the house, smiling warmly. "Welcome," she said. "You must be here for the night. We don't get many visitors out here these days." I nodded, feeling a bit uneasy but too tired to care. She showed me to a small room upstairs, with a single bed and a dresser. The wallpaper was faded and peeling, and the wooden floorboards creaked underfoot. She handed me an old-fashioned key and told me breakfast would be served at 7 a.m. sharp. After she left, I locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted. The room was stiflingly hot, so I opened the window to let in some air. The cornfields outside were bathed in moonlight, and the sound of rustling corn was almost hypnotic. I quickly drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, a soft rustling noise that seemed to be coming from outside the window. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and listened carefully. The rustling grew louder, more insistent, like something was moving through the cornfield. I got out of bed and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the endless rows of corn swaying gently in the night breeze. But then, I noticed movement. Something was moving through the corn, heading straight for the house. I strained to see what it was, but the moonlight only illuminated the tops of the corn stalks. The rustling grew louder, and I felt a creeping sense of dread as I realized whatever was out there was getting closer. I closed the window and locked it, my heart racing. The noise stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it, a soft tap on the window, like someone lightly tapping their fingers against the glass. I froze, my blood running cold. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was trying to get my attention. I slowly backed away from the window, not daring to look out. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, but I could make out the words. "Let me in." I stumbled back, crashing into the dresser. The whispering continued, growing louder, more urgent. "Let me in, let me in." I bolted for the door, fumbling with the key as I tried to unlock it. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. I finally got the door open and ran down the stairs, not bothering to be quiet. The house was dark and silent, the old floorboards creaking under my feet as I raced toward the front door. I threw open the door and ran out into the night, not stopping until I reached my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped down the gravel road, kicking up dust as I tore through the cornfields. In the rearview mirror, I saw the farmhouse growing smaller in the distance, its windows dark and empty. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I found a small motel and checked in for the night. I didn't sleep much, haunted by the memory of the tapping on the window and the whispering voice. The man on the radio. In the fall of 2012, I was living in a small town in West Virginia, working as a late-night radio DJ for a local station. The job was quiet and lonely, especially during the midnight to 4 a.m. shift. The station was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by woods, with only a single road leading in and out. On most nights, it felt like I was the only person awake in the entire town. My job was simple: play music, take the occasional request, and talk to whoever was bored enough to call in during those late hours. The station's reach was limited, so most of the callers were regulars, truckers passing through, insomniacs, and the occasional conspiracy theorist who wanted to rant about aliens or government cover-ups. One night, around 2 a.m., the phone rang. I was in the middle of a song, so I let it ring a few times before picking up. On the other end was a man's voice, low and gravelly, with a thick accent I couldn't quite place. "Hello," I said, expecting the usual banter or a song request. The man didn't respond right away. I could hear him breathing heavily, as if he had just run a long distance. "Can I help you?" I asked, growing a bit uneasy. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "They're watching you." I blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" "They're watching you," he repeated, his voice full of urgency. "They know where you are. They're coming for you." I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd had my share of prank calls and strange conversations, but something about this man's tone was different. It wasn't playful or mocking. It was serious, almost desperate. "Who's watching me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They are," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They've been watching you for a long time. Don't you see them? Haven't you felt it?" I glanced around the small, dimly lit studio. The only light came from the flickering fluorescent bulbs above me and the glow of the computer screen. Outside, the woods were pitch black, and the only sound was the low hum of the radio equipment. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to end the conversation. "Maybe you should call someone else." Before I could hang up, the man's voice grew frantic. "You need to get out of there, now, before it's too late." Then the line went dead. I stared at the receiver, my heart pounding. The conversation had left me rattled, but I tried to brush it off as just another crazy caller. I went back to playing music, but the words lingered in my mind. "They're watching you." An hour later, the phone rang again. I hesitated before answering, half expecting it to be the same man. But this time, it was someone else, a woman with a shaky voice. "Hello," she said. "Is this the DJ?" "Yes, it is," I replied, relieved to hear a different voice. "What can I do for you?" "There's someone outside my house," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw him through the window. He's just standing there watching me." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Have you called the police?" I tried, but the line was busy, she said, sounding on the verge of tears. "I don't know what to do. I'm so scared." I tried to reassure her, telling her to stay inside and lock her doors while I called the police for her. As I was about to hang up, I heard something in the background, a faint rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on glass. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I strained to listen, and the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like it was coming from right outside her window. Then, in the middle of our conversation, the line went dead. I immediately called the police, giving them the details and the woman's location. They promised to send someone to check it out, but I was left with a growing sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, that the two calls were somehow connected. I went back on the air, trying to keep my voice steady, but the studio suddenly felt stifling, the darkness outside pressing in on me. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there watching me. The minutes ticked by slowly, and the phone remained silent. I played one song after another, my nerves on edge, until finally, at around 3:30 a.m., the phone rang again. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the receiver. When I finally picked it up, I was met with silence on the other end. "Hello," I said cautiously. No response. Just silence, followed by a faint, raspy breathing. My heart raced as I listened, waiting for the person to speak, but they didn't. Instead, I heard a soft, barely audible whisper. "They're here." The line went dead. I sat there in stunned silence, the receiver still in my hand. The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a deep sense of dread. I couldn't stay in that studio any longer. I had to get out, had to leave before whatever was out there found me. The midnight train. In the fall of 2013, I was living in a small town in Colorado, working as a night shift security guard at a train yard. The train yard was an expensive, desolate place filled with rows of rusting freight cars, old engines, and forgotten tracks. The yard was mostly used for storing decommissioned trains and equipment, and it was rare for anyone to come through during the night. My job was to patrol the area, making sure nothing was tampered with and that no one wandered onto the property. The train yard had a reputation among the guards. Stories circulated about strange noises, phantom trains, and figures seen in the shadows. I was skeptical of these tales, attributing them to overactive imaginations and the eerie atmosphere of the place. But one night, I experienced something that made me rethink everything I thought I knew. It was a cold, moonless night, and I was doing my usual rounds, walking along the rows of train cars with only my flashlight for company. The wind howled through the yard, making the old metal creak and groan. I had just passed an old caboose when I heard it, a distant, mournful whistle, like the sound of a train approaching. I stopped in my tracks, listening carefully. The train yard hadn't been active in years, and no trains were scheduled to pass through that night. But the whistle grew louder, echoing through the empty yard. I could feel the ground beneath my feet start to vibrate, as if a train was approaching. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started walking toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I neared the source of the noise, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, on the tracks ahead of me, was an old steam locomotive. It was a massive black engine with a plume of smoke rising from its stack. The train looked ancient, like something out of a history book, with its rusted exterior and dimly glowing headlights. But what struck me most was that the train wasn't moving. It was just sitting there, motionless on the tracks, despite the sound of the whistle and the vibrations in the ground. I cautiously approached the engine, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The closer I got, the more I realized something was wrong. The air around the train felt thick and heavy, like it was charged with electricity. The wind had died down, and an eerie silence had settled over the yard. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but my voice was swallowed by the stillness. There was no response, no sign of life. I decided to climb up onto the engine to take a closer look. As I pulled myself up onto the footplate, I was hit by a wave of cold air that made my breath freeze in my throat. The inside of the cab was dark, the controls covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. It looked as if no one had been inside for decades. I shone my flashlight around the cab, but something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. There, sitting in the engineer's seat, was a figure, a man, dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. His head was down, his face hidden by the brim of his hat, and his hands rested on the controls. My heart pounded in my chest as I called out to him, but he didn't move. He just sat there, as still as a statue. I took a step closer, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The moment my hand made contact, the figure vanished. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the engine in my shock. The seat was empty, the air in the cab suddenly freezing cold. I scrambled down from the train, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The whistle sounded again, louder this time, and I saw the headlights flicker to life. The The train slowly began to move, its wheels creaking as it rolled down the tracks. I stood there, frozen in place, as the locomotive picked up speed, chugging away into the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the train vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving nothing but silence and the lingering smell of smoke in the air. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what I had just seen. There were no tracks leading away from where the train had been, no sign that it had ever existed. It was as if the whole thing had been a hallucination, a figment of my imagination. But I knew what I had seen. I knew the cold, the fear, the man in the engineer's seat. It was real as anything I had ever experienced. I finished my shift that night in a daze, unable to shake the image of the ghostly train. The next day, I asked some of the other guards if they had ever seen anything strange in the yard, and one of them, a grizzled old man who had been working there for decades, nodded solemnly. The crying in the cemetery. In the spring of 2014, I was working as a groundskeeper at a small cemetery in New England. It was a peaceful job, and I spent most of my days tending to the graves, mowing the grass, and making sure the cemetery was well maintained. The cemetery was old, with many of the headstones dating back to the 1800s. It was a quiet place, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the town, surrounded by thick woods. The locals believed the cemetery was haunted. There were stories of ghostly apparitions, strange lights, and disembodied voices. I didn't pay much attention to the tales. After all, I had never experienced anything out of the ordinary in my time working there. But one evening, something happened that I still can't explain. I had stayed late that day to finish up some work, and by the time I was done, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. The cemetery was deserted, the air cool and still. As I was packing up my tools, I heard it, a faint sound like someone crying. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The crying was soft, almost a whimper, and it seemed to be coming from the far end of the cemetery, near an old overgrown section that hadn't been visited in years. My first thought was that someone had come to the cemetery after hours, perhaps grieving for a loved one, and needed help. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the sound. The closer I got, the clearer the crying became. It was a woman's voice, filled with sorrow and despair. My heart ached for whoever it was, and I quickened my pace, determined to offer comfort. As I reached the overgrown section, I noticed something strange. The crying didn't seem to be coming from any specific direction. It echoed all around me, as if the sound was being carried by the wind. I shone my flashlight around, but there was no one there, just rows of weathered headstones covered in moss and ivy. The crying continued, growing louder and more intense. It was a heart-wrenching sound, full of pain and anguish. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. The crying seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. A sense of unease began to settle over me. I had been in that cemetery countless times, but never had I felt anything like this. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, creeping toward me like dark fingers. I tried to leave, but something compelled me to stay, to find the source of the crying. I wandered through the old section, my flashlight flickering as I passed by the forgotten graves. The crying grew louder still, until it was almost unbearable, like a chorus of voices weeping in the night. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. The silence was deafening. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me, and I could feel a presence, something watching me from the darkness. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing among the headstones, was a figure, a woman in a long flowing dress, her face obscured by a veil of shadow. She was barely visible in the dim light, her form ethereal and ghostly. She stood motionless, her head bowed, as if she was grieving. I called out to her, asking if she needed help, but she didn't respond. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just stood there, silent and still. I took a step closer, and as I did, she slowly raised her head. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, just an empty, silent scream. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly. The woman began to fade, her form dissolving into the shadows. The crying started again, louder this time, echoing all around me as the woman disappeared into the darkness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, sprinting through the rows of graves, the crying still ringing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the gates of the cemetery, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I never returned to that section of the cemetery again. I kept my distance, tending to the more frequented areas during the day, but the memory of that night stayed with me. The woman's face, her empty eyes, the sound of her crying, it haunted my dreams for weeks. I later learned that the overgrown section of the cemetery was the resting place of several women who had died in tragic circumstances, drownings, suicides, lost loves. The locals believed that their spirits were trapped there, unable to find peace, their sorrow echoing through the cemetery at night. I don't know if that's true, but I do know what I heard and saw that night. And I'll never forget the sound of that crying, or the feeling of being watched by something that didn't belong in this world. The stranger in the photos. In the winter of 2015, I was living in a small apartment in a historic building in downtown Boston. The building was over a century old, with creaky floors, narrow hallways, and a distinct sense of history in every corner. I loved it for its charm and character, but I couldn't ignore the strange feeling that something was always watching me, especially at night. I was an amateur photographer, and I spent most of my weekends wandering the city, capturing its beauty through my lens. My apartment was filled with photos I'd taken over the years, landscapes, cityscapes, candid shots of people in the streets. It was a hobby I was passionate about, and it helped me feel connected to the world around me. One Saturday, I decided to spend the day exploring some of the older neighborhoods in the city. I took dozens of photos, focusing on the architecture, the old buildings, and the quiet, snow-covered streets. By the time I got home, it was late, and I was eager to go through the photos and start editing them. As I sat at my computer, scrolling through the images, something caught my eye. In one of the photos, taken in front of an old brownstone, there was a figure standing in the background, partially obscured by the shadows. At first, I didn't think much of it, just a random passerby, I assumed. But as I continued to look through the photos, I started to notice the same figure appearing in several of them. The figure was always in the background, always slightly out of focus. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a hat that cast his face in shadow. He was never in the same place twice, but he was always there watching. A chill ran down my spine as I realized this. I hadn't noticed anyone following me that day, and the figure wasn't in every photo, just enough to be unsettling. I zoomed in on one of the images, trying to get a better look at his face, but it was impossible to make out any features. He was just a dark silhouette, blending into the background. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that it was probably just a local out for a walk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to put the photos away and try to forget about it, but that night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing there watching me. The next day, I went out again, trying to distract myself with more photography. I took a different route this time, exploring a park on the outskirts of the city. It was a quiet day, with few people around, and I spent hours capturing the peaceful winter landscape. When I got home and reviewed the photos, my heart sank. The figure was there again. This time, he was closer, his outline more distinct against the snowy background. He was standing near a tree, partially hidden by the branches, but his presence was unmistakable. I flipped through the photos, and he appeared in several of them, always in the background, always watching. I felt a growing sense of dread. This couldn't be a coincidence. Whoever this was, they were following me, but how could they know where I would be? I hadn't seen anyone nearby while I was taking the photos, and yet the figure was there, lurking in the shadows. I decided to show the photos to a friend of mine, hoping they could help me make sense of it. When they saw the images, their reaction was immediate. They were just as disturbed as I was. They suggested I go to the police, but I hesitated. What could I tell them? That mysterious figure kept showing up in my photos. It sounded crazy, and I wasn't sure they would take me seriously. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. Every noise, every creak of the old building made me jump. I kept thinking about the figure, about those dark, shadowed eyes staring at me through the lens. I wondered who he was, what he wanted, and why he was following me. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling restless and anxious. I decided to go through my old photo albums, thinking it might help me calm down. As I flipped through the pages, something caught my eye. In one of the older photos, taken almost a year earlier, I saw him. The same figure, standing in the background, barely noticeable but unmistakable. He was there, just as he had been in the recent photos, watching me. My heart pounded as I frantically searched through more of my albums. The figure appeared again and again in photos I had taken over the past year. He had been there all alone, lurking in the shadows, and I had never noticed. I felt sick to my stomach. Whoever this was, they had been following me for a long time, watching me, and I had been completely unaware. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to do something.